All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be doing two things. We're going to be continuing the tafsir, of course, ayah 82 to 90, even though we kind of gave a certain level of thorough tafsir, but we're going to go a little bit more thorough by looking at one, the relationship between the names that were mentioned here, according to some scholars, of course, and what they see in these names. The second one will also talk about the theme, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wanting us to know, the relationship between the argument that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam had laid out, and plus the theme in what do we actually get out of all of this. And certainly the theme that we would come out even with the prophets and the messengers, what is the theme? And that's basically laid out at the end. And inshallah, we'll also be going back to Tafsir al-Qurtubi and kind of, see some certain points that we might have skipped and actually comment on some of Tafsir al-Qurtubi and see what Tafsir al-Qurtubi had to say in regards to certain ayat, in regards to certain words. We might have sometimes missed a word here and there. It would be a really good idea to just go over it. It kind of feels good, of course, that we're right now pretty much, let's see, we're on page 445 on the 8th volume. I know you're kind of glitching right there, but it'll get itself situated, inshallah. So we're really close to even ending the 8th volume. So they are 21 volumes. We're right now on the 8th volume of Tafsir al-Qurtubi. Well, I should say 20 volumes because the 21st volume is actually glossary and all of that. So I should just say 20. Okay. So let's go over it right here. Let's first of all, let's see the ayat وَكَيْفَ أَخَافُ مَا أَشْرَكْتُمْ وَلَا تَخَافُونَ أَنَّكُمْ أَشْرَكْتُمْ بِاللَّهِ مَا لَمْ يُنَزِّلْ بِهِ عَلَيْكُمْ سُلْطَانًا. So we went in details in regards to fear. And do prophets actually feel fear? Do we feel fear? And of course, when we speak about fear, it's different kinds of fear. There is the fear that is considered jibilli, or part of our instinct. That's a natural fear that we will all feel regardless of the level of faith that you're in, because it's part of your own natural instinct. So it has nothing to do with faith. And that fear, let's say, someone all of a sudden pops up and you get startled that you didn't expect someone to just show up, then in that situation, that would be part of this, let's call it this natural fear. Fear of maybe illness, fear of maybe unexpected things that might happen, all of that is basically part of the natural fear. But the fear of perhaps losing rizq, the fear where your own principles might be put at risk, and it's either that I would jeopardize or possibly even give up on certain principles in order to get to a certain, perhaps a certain, let's say, compensation or a certain reward. Of course, for a believer, that's when things kind of change. For a believer, they recognize that this fear within dunya is limited, and that the main concern and main fear is actually in akhirah. So they basically weigh their fears. And in fact, it's important to say that part of iman, part of faith, is putting your fear within its own limited space. In other words, part of iman is having courage. Part of iman is having courage. What does that look like? So then in that situation, that you might actually be threatened to give up on your faith, or probably get into losing your job, or perhaps maybe losing your home, or maybe giving up on your maybe taking away your nationality or your residency or whatever it is. All of that is basically a threat. So you put it within the parameter of, okay, is this worth my akhirah or dunya? What am I actually losing? So for a believer, the fear might actually be there because it's part of our natural instinct. But for a believer, putting it within a balanced level is what a believer's eye would basically study this in. They would recognize So for a believer, they would recognize the limitations of that fear on their life, on their risks, on their health, all of that, because they would consider Allahu Akbar. They would consider that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest. Therefore, what they might threaten you with, or this dunya, what you might be afraid of, it's only limited in this dunya, and therefore that is to bring courage within you. That is to empower you with courage and take away a lot of the fear, including the natural fears that you might be getting as part of your instinct. Okay, so we talked a little about that. In fact, we had some of the lectures, we did actually talk about fear and courage in a lot more detail. Okay, let's continue. وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيم. That's the argument that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given Prophet Ibrahim. And when you say تِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيم, in other words, even the ability to debate, the ability to argue, the ability to put forward an idea, to be able to be consistent, to be able to be determined, is empowerment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيم. What is al-ityan? Al-ityan is to give something without nothing in return. That's why we say ita is zakah, to give something without having something in return. That's why we say آتِ ذَا الْقُرْبَى حَقَّهُ, or إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. Why إِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى? You could be doing something to your parents and maybe not necessarily getting something in return. You could be doing something to your siblings and not necessarily getting something or expecting something always in return. That's إِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. Don't always expect that there would be something in return. You have to recognize that the relationship between you and your siblings, between you and your family, is farther than the formality that you might engage in with maybe other strangers. That formality with strangers, that's expected to be based on perhaps certain level of exchange of, of course, reciprocal, certain level of exchange of benefit. But for family, no, it doesn't always have to be as a certain exchange of benefit. Some of it is that you're contributing, and not necessarily for the sake of benefit, but for the sake of akhirah. You're contributing for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're contributing for the sake of perhaps maybe the support, whether you might value that or maybe you might not value it. So we recognize family is completely different than other relations. And it's quite sad that in the modern life that we're living in, the value of family had become forgotten, had become something that they don't necessarily value, because you would see that it is more portrayed as mentally as mentally burdening you and not necessarily uplifting the burden. And that's something that I would often see people calling me, and specifically women. Sorry, ladies. I'm so sorry, ladies. But I know sometimes I may be heavy on women, but that's because I deal with women more than I deal with men, of course. So, ladies, when I'm heavy on you, it's not necessarily that I'm regarding that men are innocent, but it's something that I deal with, more than men. So it becomes as if, I'm a misogynist person, but no. But the situation is I see fitna surrounding a lot of women in that regards. And then they would think, and of course, especially feminism had actually portrayed men as being the area of danger, and therefore the fathers given a picture that they are patriarchal, authoritative, narcissist, etc. And then that makes those women accessible to the narcissists that are outside. The ones that are really trying to find an easy access to you, and then you become an easier access to those that are outside by taking away your fatherly, let's call it, yes, authoritative, you can call it, but authoritative carries a connotation of being something rather that is just laying out orders just for the sake of their own interest and just to be in a position of power and not necessarily to serve your interest and benefit and all of that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given these fathers the instinct to be protective over you and be considerate to make sure that you are safe. So ladies, when you might feel that your fathers are overprotective or trying to put in all these different rules, it's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them the instinct to basically take care of you, even though you might not necessarily always feel those emotions that you might feel from your mother. But the different ways that people express emotions of care or maybe love, etc., is completely different. So you might express an emotion of, let's say you're a mother and you're screaming at your child for not doing their homework. I'm not saying it's right to scream at your child, but let's say you're like, okay, got to do your homework. They're not refusing to do it. But then why would you yell at your child? You wouldn't yell at them out of hate or out of perhaps, harm, that you're trying to somehow be authoritative, etc. But you're probably recognizing the danger of not being probably successful in school and what that might look like. So you start panicking because you recognize that what the trajectory is looking like. So you start panicking because you recognize the trajectory perhaps 20 years from now or 15 years from now. So you panic based on that. But the child is thinking, my mom is being mean to me, and not recognizing that, no, she's actually worried about you. That's the same thing when it comes to the fathers. The modern, and I would say the modern society with the feminist agenda is actually painting the fathers with this brush that they are nothing but vicious and narcissist fathers that are authoritative, that are trying to take away your power and not necessarily trying to give you protection. Anyhow, why am I actually saying that? I'm saying وَآتِ ذَا الْقُرْبَى حَقَّهُ, and I'm also putting it within that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned in the ayah, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. That's that point. إِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. Recognizing ذِي الْقُرْبَى, whether your fathers, your brothers, your sisters, your mother, and what they contributed in your life, and how they have a good influence in making you who you are is extremely important. Don't necessarily expect that people are always supposed to be giving you a smile just to make you feel good. Sometimes the smile, or just because someone is showing you their teeth, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're giving you a smile. It could actually be a hidden vicious intention to harm. So just be careful with all of those smiles that you might actually see out on the street, and those guys that are really probably just wanting to get their lust basically with you, and not really care later on in being responsible for whatever is needed to make family or whatever. Allah al-Musta'an. Sorry, ladies, you could see, it's quite sad that when you hear a lot of these stories and how many women were manipulated emotionally. They were manipulated to thinking that those people are caring, they're loving, etc. And especially fathers, sometimes within certain cultures, fathers might sometimes be taught that they're not supposed to be expressing emotions, and expressing emotions is a sign of weakness. In some cultures, that a father is supposed to be just expressing a pragmatic personality, an authoritative personality in order to put things in structure. And then, of course, in a society that is right now feeding on social media, on fake emotions and all of these different aesthetics that are right now portrayed, many women, especially women, they're attracted to that, and they cannot distinguish between reality and between what was done for the sake of a camera, or for the sake of probably appearing in a certain way on social media. And then their expectations sometimes are not realistic of what they expect of their family, what they expect of their husbands, what they expect of others. And then they would live this personality that is always feeling like a victim, and entitlement. It's entitlement that everybody is supposed to be giving me, contributing to make me happy, to make me basically live in a life where, like, I'm a princess. So not recognizing that that's not the reality of life. You have to contribute, and you have to recognize that some of your family members may be harmful, but sometimes harm, or let me not use the word harm, I'll use the word pain instead. Some pain, because harm only has one thing, but pain. Some pain may be necessary for us to recognize that we need treatment, that we need to fix some things. And yes, sometimes your family, your father, your mother can inflict pain, maybe, let's say, psychological pain, telling you, hey, this is not right, you need to clean this is not right, your grades are not looking great. And I think in the society where, yes, we got to make sure that we're always encouraging, well, that's not the reality of society. Sometimes we have to say things as is and say, your grades are revealing that you're heading towards failure. Your room, your hygiene is actually revealing you're heading towards illness. You're heading towards lack of structure, etc. And not always pat on the back. We love you. You're great. We love you the way you are. You're great the way you are, etc. Because that's not real. Sorry, I definitely got off track. I know that for sure. But I think it's important to sometimes, comment on these things that we're seeing within our society, and especially the younger teenagers, and how they would be consuming within social media that's actually giving them a completely different interpretation of reality. And as parents, we have to come in and actually take away some of those areas of comfort zones and put them on the track of telling them, well, sometimes you need to get out of your comfort zone and actually get into an area that you may not be comfortable in, but it will produce a lot and get a lot out of you. It will get the juice out of you, and that's when you will see the best come out. Okay. All right, so when you look at the ayah, تِلْكَ وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ, just recognizing that, of course, all of that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned in terms of the argument, it was حُجَّتُنَا. What is al-hujjah? Al-hujjah is an argument, but al-hujjah is also evidence. Al-hujjah can be an argument and can also be an evidence. So the evidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given it to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Okay, so when you speak about evidence, you're speaking about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was also giving the inspiration to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to enable him to debate, to enable him to argue, to enable him to put the evidence. And we're speaking about al-hujjah is more directed at mental evidence. So logic, we're speaking about maybe the argument itself, just relating to logic, mental arguments, etc. That's usually what al-hujjah is related to. Okay. آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ. When you look at ala, this is indicating an indicative of being beyond. عَلَى قَوْمِهِ, that he was given evidence, argument, the ability to debate and be beyond his people. Okay, now this is important to also encourage our children, that it's also important to see when you compare yourself with others, where are you going? What do your grades say about you? What does your hygiene say about you? What does your commitment say about you? What does that reveal about you disciplining yourself in what personality? Why am I saying that? Because you always need to use these comparisons in a society, of course, with, the modern psychology. They're telling you don't compare, but that's not actually true. In Islam, you will always see that there's always the comparison there, that in order to create a competition, in order to create a personality that is willing to go and elevate a certain standard, competition is always necessary in order to basically elevate and go up at a higher standard. And this is extremely important and of course, when you look at a society right now in the West, for example, it's always telling you, well, no, you shouldn't be competing because this is going to create some form of discomfort. In Islam, no, you have to put sometimes yourself in an area of discomfort, in that you cannot actually be a person of Iman unless you get out of your comfort zone. In Islam, certainly, yes, this is haram, this is makruh, this is wajib, this is fard, etc. Even though it's not your comfort zone to probably get and leave what is haram. But Islam is telling you, no, even though you're comfortable in that area, but I want you to get out of your comfort zone and I want you to go into your wajib and I want you to force yourself in that area. But I don't feel comfortable. But it's too hard on me. It's too much pressure. Yes, I want you to pressure yourself. I want you to get your inner intention, your inner niyyah. I want you to get your determination in place and actually push yourself out of that comfort zone, haram area, into something that is probably hard on you and get into that area. And I would like to mention that we are seeing boys more capable of doing that than girls, at least in our modern times. Sorry, ladies. Again, I'm so sorry, but I think sometimes you will not get that treatment in place unless you have the right diagnosis. When we're seeing doctors, we go to the doctor and we would say, hey, I'm feeling pain there, I'm feeling pain there, but you don't say, this is feeling good and this is feeling good, this is functioning well, and that's functioning well. You would go to the doctor and the doctors will basically say, okay, health ministry, these are the illnesses that are coming to our offices, these are the number of cases, this is what we're seeing, and this is what we need to basically review, study, and so forth. And that's what I'm trying to basically sound this bell and this horn on and say, ladies, we really have a problem. We really have a problem. We really have a big, let's say, conspiracy that is affecting our women, their psychology, their deen, and their deen. And a lot of that deen is affected through, and I would say influenced by, the psychology and all of those so-called studies that are presented as studies. They're presented as studies, but really they're actually an agenda. Be careful. Ladies, please be careful and get that ilm, because we're seeing a lot more women actually get lost in this manipulation and their deen being affected. Allah al-Musta'an. I'm so sorry, ladies. So many times I would want to break down and just cry because I see this all the time. And it's very sad to see that we have a lot of women that got lost on university campuses. Definitely, we want to encourage women to study. Definitely, we want to encourage women to be prepared for all those situations where she might be needing to support herself, or there's no doubt about that. But to be honest, when you are seeing that the many women that had been encouraged to go out on university campuses and actually study in those mixed universities and in those environments, and then get a job and all of that, and we are telling them that, yeah, you're becoming independent, you're not in need of a man, you're not in need of anybody right now, you can do it on your own, etc. And then we're seeing more and more numbers of women losing their deen. I'm just, right there, just sounding the bell and that horn and saying, wait, something's wrong right there. We're seeing more women lose their deen. Sorry, ladies. Yes, we are seeing more women lose their deen than men. We're seeing more women get into that manipulation than men. I don't know what the reasons are, but I just know that we're seeing more women right now getting lost within this fitna than men. And that takes me to the time of the Dajjal, when the Prophet ﷺ had said that we would have more men actually stay away and recognize the fitna of the Dajjal, but more women would get into this narrative that the Dajjal had created. and then they'd get manipulated and they would follow Dajjal. Allahul Musta'an. I don't have specific numbers that I can lay out, but being on university campuses, I will just say, go to university campuses and see by the first year that they enter college, and then by the time they graduate, how many fall out? How many lose their deen? How many end up in atheism, LGBT, feminism? How many are lost within this area? Compare the boys and compare the girls. Allahul Musta'an. Allahul Musta'an. الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُم بِظُلْمٍ. And certainly, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, those that would believe, and we went in details with this one, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُم بِظُلْمٍ أُولَئِكَ لَهُمُ الْأَمْنُ. Let's see what Tafseer al-Qurtubi had to say. So, تِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيم. He said Mujahid was considering that the argument that he was given was actually this one. This is the argument. And this is the point and the statement that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was given. Those that would believe and do not confuse and mix with their faith any transgression, those are the people that would have security, and that those would be the ones to be guided. Okay? And of course, that was the tafsir that Mujahid had laid out, but other scholars had said, well, no. The argument is that he basically was comparing their gods and telling them, well, if you would consider that a bigger god or a bigger idol resembles a bigger god, or a smaller idol resembles a smaller god, then with the same logic, then we're talking about the moon, we're talking about the star, we're talking about the sun, etc. Then are you going to consider this is a bigger god, this is a smaller god? Then who's the god that's actually responsible for life? Who's the god that's responsible for death? Who is considered the ultimate God that had given basically the creation, the beginning of life? So that's when, of course, نرفع درجات من نشاء, whether we're speaking about the argument to be able to display the evidence, or whether the argument to be able to display the theme that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given, in other words, the statement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent. All of that is نرفع درجات من نشاء. Now, this is important to keep in mind, that yes, some may be given the ability to make an argument or prove an idea, and others may not necessarily be given the ability to probably prove an idea, an argument, but others may be given the authority, or at least the ability to teach the ilm itself. Not everyone is capable of teaching ilm, and not every alim is necessarily a person that would be given the ability to debate and perhaps state an evidence on something. Now, this is extremely important, which Ibn Taymiyyah paid attention to. Ibn Taymiyyah was this exceptional scholar. I must admit, I think he didn't get the attention that he deserves. Let me tell you a little bit about Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was living in Syria. And the situation is very similar to the situation that we're living today. You've got the Mongols invaded 2/3 of the Muslim world. The Mongols had no mercy whatsoever, not to any living creature, nothing, not people, not animals, no one. The Mongols, when they had invaded Baghdad, killed nearly a million male, female, child, elderly, just made a whole pool of blood in Baghdad. And certainly when the Syrians had basically seen what happened in Baghdad, they certainly got scared and decided, you know what, this is too scary, and basically decided to surrender. Okay, they surrendered. It was an easy thing, where the Mongols continued their way all the way. That's the situation that Ibn Taymiyyah was living in, a society that had surrendered to the Mongols, a khilafah that was nothing but an image that did not have any power. The Muslims were now starting to adopt the behavior, the culture of the Mongols. The Muslims had lost their faith. The ilm is basically right there, being mixed with a lot of these superstition things, and it was just chaotic. Who else was coming in as a power? The Shia. Wow. Just like today. Of course, why it would seem that Shi'ism was getting power, and who was also having the audacity to debate the Muslims as well, was also the Christians. Just imagine the Muslims losing not only their self-esteem, their confidence, because of the political situation, but now their deen is at risk. So Ibn Taymiyyah, you would see in his books, and by the way, Ibn Taymiyyah was teaching Islam. I want you to look at this one. He was actually teaching Islam at the masjid, right? And then decided that no, he doesn't want to be at the masjid. He was imprisoned, and he felt that imprisonment was a better option for him because it gave him, well, he was basically in this space where there was no interaction with the public, with the people. He was capable of writing, and definitely in this locked space, he was capable of thinking, and certainly they were getting him a little bits of pieces of food just for him to survive. So he didn't have to worry about getting a job because, hey, they were giving him basically some of that. And what was it? It wasn't necessarily a fun thing to do, but it was for the sake of akhirah. Never got married, okay? And his students would have to go in, well, one of them was Sijin Tadmur. Yeah, Sijin Tadmur, today, Sijin Tadmur, yes, today's Tadmur prison, okay? And that prison, okay, was actually in the middle, it was in the middle of the sea. It was like an island. And that's where his students would come, and he would throw whatever he had written, whatever he had studied and reviewed and all of that, and he would basically throw it out of the window, and they would catch it, and they would basically right there teach it. And that was Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah, when you look at, I studied al-Jawab al-Sahih. Although al-Jawab al-Sahih liman baddala din al-Masih, although it wasn't necessarily showing that he knew, for example, other languages and so forth, but definitely he was benefiting, whether it's Samawat ibn Yahya or whether it's from other scholars, al-Qurtubi, etc., that had written in other faiths, but he was using those arguments to debate the Christians and using those notes in order to basically bring about that debate and that argument. And that's the point that I would want to make. It's the issue of argument. And he, in his book, Minhaj al-Sunnah, you might think of it as relating to Sunnah, but it's actually a debate with the Shia. It's a 4 or 5 volumed book, debate with the Shia. And in his book, he was, debating one argument after the other. And in his book, you would see a very smart and a genius scholar. And one thing I would like to note in this regards, when I had said نرفع درجات من نشاء, he was mentioning that not every scholar is capable of debating, and not every person that is capable of debating is necessarily a scholar. I would like to emphasize this note. But he also had mentioned that if a person is involved in debate, debating Christians, debating Shias, Jews, whatever it is, if they are involved in debate, they have to have the ilm. They have to have the ilm of both, the ilm of the other opponent and the ilm of Islam, to make sure that they are not confusing the evidence and that they're actually bringing in an argument that's based on Islam and not necessarily based on their own interpretation, that sometimes, of course, our own mind can sometimes manipulate us into a certain argument. Now, this is extremely important to mention. Many times we would confuse a person being a alim, and we would expect them to probably be the ones to debate. Debate is a skill. Debate is a skill not everyone is good at, okay? And that's one thing. Giving da'wah is a skill. Not everyone is good at giving da'wah. You can have the ilm, but not have the skill of giving da'wah. You can have the skill of giving da'wah, but not necessarily have the ilm, and I would say, like a vast ilm, okay? Just because a person was capable of giving da'wah, that doesn't necessarily mean that they qualify for giving fatwa. Same thing. Just because somebody is capable of giving a fatwa does not mean that they're capable of being judges. That's a completely different field. Ilm is displaying whatever they had learned, connecting different ideas, and basically displaying what they had learned and displaying the kitab, the sunnah, what they had learned. If it's other sciences, that's ilm. Okay? And another piece of ilm is understanding the reality. So what do I mean by reality? So there's ilm where you're probably studying fiqh, okay? But just because I studied fiqh, it doesn't mean I'm capable of answering each and every single question on fiqh. Because certain issues on fiqh require that I would have knowledge. Let's say I'm being asked about fiqh of transactions. I'm asked about banking and whether taking this kind of loan or that kind of loan or working within this type of bank or whatever it is, all of that. This is a whole system that this person that studied fiqh is not fully in ground and fully aware of how that system works. So therefore, they might have the fiqh in the text, but not in the context of what they're making a fatwa on. Same thing. If we're talking about perhaps maybe medical issues, we would need experts in medicine to probably explain this medical area and how it works and what that means and the effect and what studies are saying, etc., in order to give a fatwa in that regards, because it's connecting between the text and the context. This is extremely important. So when we look at نرفع درجات من نشاء, okay, want you to look at this one, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will elevate the darajat, the different levels. Okay, how do we elevate those levels? You've got the ilm and you've got al-fahm. Al-ilm is knowledge in something. Al-fahm is the ability to comprehend it, to understand it, which is text and context. That's al-fahm. Al-ilm is to know. Al-fahm is to understand text and context. And I would like to say, when you look at text in context, there is another piece of context. Sometimes we would only look at the context, perhaps the area that relates to medicine or probably banking or whatever, these different things that we talked about. But there's another context, which is the cultural context. Okay, this is extremely important. That's why so many times I would get a sister come to me and I would say, what cultural background are you coming from? I'm coming from this cultural background. I would say, go to the scholars that are from your community. Why? Because they would understand the context that explains some of the things in how we would apply the text to the context. And I would say, go to somebody from your own culture that understands your culture, the context of, especially if we're talking about marriage and divorce, we would need somebody from within your context to basically explain to you or explain the rule or explain how do we get to maqasid al-sharia, how we get to the legal maxims. So the other part, al-imamatu wal-mulk. What is al-imama? Al-imama is leadership and al-mulk. I would want to say, when you look at the word darajat, there is a word that وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. It's completely irrelevant. But from one angle, it actually relates to al-imamatu wal-mulk. How? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says in regards to men that alayhinna daraja. What is it, daraja? It daraja means a step. It daraja means a level that is of a higher position. And it takes me and connects it with الرجال قوامون على النساء. If you say وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ, that men have a certain level that is beyond women. That's an ayah in the Quran. I'm not making this up. وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. What is that related to? How is it that men have a higher thing? What is it that they are privileged with that we may not be privileged in the same way? Al-imamatu wal-mulk, leadership, al-qawama, a certain authority. Al-mulk is authority. Yes, authority. That they're privileged. I thought you said that wasn't tashrif, but that was taklif. Indeed, it's a taklif, it's a responsibility, and not necessarily an honor. They'll be held accountable for that, but at the same time, it is from one angle, when you are basically the person in leadership, you definitely will have certain privileges that the other person is not getting the same privilege. There's no doubt. You look at the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, فَإِنَّهُنَّ عَوَانٌ عِنْدَكُمْ. The Prophet ﷺ literally said, that women are عوان عندكم. What is العاني? العاني is الأسير, is the hostage. When you take away somebody's freedom, that's what a hostage is. They're basically under your power. So what does that mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and just as in this hadith, literally said, this hadith is saying, فَإِنَّهُنَّ عَوَانٌ عَنْدَكُمْ, the man has a higher privilege in al-imam wal-mulk, in leadership, in authority, in dictating certain things, determining certain decisions, etc. Whether it's a father, whether it's a husband, yes, there are certain things. Why? Why was that the case? Why would we even consider that? Why can't we just reinterpret it in a different way? A couple of things. We don't interpret the religion to suit the society and what they want to believe. We let the religion inform us of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, created the men and created the women. We let Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who created the structure of everything, actually inform us of how the best way to balance everything is supposed to be in structure. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَّن نَشَاءُ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will elevate whomever He wills. That's the same thing related to, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala determines something, then who am I to reinterpret the structure or rearrange the structure? I cannot rearrange the structure because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created the structure. I cannot rearrange anything. And to reinterpret the structure to suit my feminist interpretation, to give myself, this feeling that, no, I'm independent and I'm this and I don't need the man, etc. All of that's taking you into a manipulation. Don't manipulate yourself. At the same time, this does not mean that women are inferior. Not whatsoever. This does not mean women are inferior, but it just means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a certain brain structure, social structure, physical, or let's call it anatomy, in men and in women that are completing one another. Part of this completion is that we would recognize what we're capable of doing and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had privileged this group with and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had privileged us with. If we don't recognize our privileges, then we will also not recognize our weaknesses and what we need in order to complete one another. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. Believing men and believing women are أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. Awliya, wait a minute, I thought you said al-wali was a decision maker, al-wali was an authority, so here it is. So therefore, even the woman can be a wali over the man in this regards based on this. I would say, right, but but they would actually, they would order for what is good. Why? Because they would believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They would get into basically considering that the text is beyond men and women. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all. Therefore, we would submit, men and women, you submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I don't submit to the man, but I submit to Allah. I submit to Allah. The second that I obey my husband because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered me to obey, as long as it doesn't go against Allah. So when you look at نرفع درجات من نشاء, we just have to recognize that there is some level of competition, privilege, and that privilege, whether we're speaking about ilm, understanding, leadership, authority, yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will arrange one side, will give one privilege, will tell us, this is what I want you to do, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created within you, and therefore you cannot battle reality. Let's continue right there. When you look at an imama wal mulk, yesterday I was talking to my son, and he was like, well, Mom, what is manhood? When you say this is what a man does, how are you as a woman teaching me about manhood? You can't tell me what manhood is if you're a woman. I say, well, I'll go back to the text. What does the text say? If you look at the text, and I did give a lecture just on masculinity, because of course we would have a lot of those lectures where men are telling us what being feminine means, but I thought it would be fair to also have a woman say what being a man is. But it's not necessarily me trying to act as feminist woman telling the men this is what it means to be a man, but what it means to be a man based on the Quran. And here's one thing. When you look at the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word rijal different from the word dhukur. What's the difference? Irrajul is giving me a connotation of masculinity. Dhakar, or let me say rajul, also chivalry. Dhakar is more male gender. Okay. When you look at the ayat, رجال لا تلهيهم تجارة ولا بيع. Rijal, men that no tijara, no business, no trade, nothing will tulhihim, nothing will get them pacified away from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching the man what it means to be a man is to be focused, is to be determined, is to be consistent. That's what it means to be a man. And that's why if you look at, for example, the different ayat, جاء رجل من أقصى المدينة يسعى. A man. جاء رجل. A man comes من أقصى المدينة, from a very far city. يسعى. When you talk about يسعى, he was rushing. قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين. He comes and announces it. قال. When you look at the word قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين, اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. What does he do? Makes an announcement. What does that announcement, although might not necessarily have been heard by everybody, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made his announcement be the announcement of a man, an announcement of power, an announcement that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made it amplified throughout the ayat for generations to come, and teach it to men and women later in the other generations and other nation, the nation of Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين. Now we teach it to the men. Teach it to the men. Teach it to the women. Say the word of haqq, even when you may not necessarily be heard. Say the word of haqq, And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will amplify it, and you have the right intention, even when your followers are not plenty. And this is important. When you look at the books of Tazkiyah, they would always announce and tell you, take the path of truth and don't let the small number of people following that path keep you away. In other words, don't get manipulated in those other paths when many people are probably following them. A singer, somebody very trivial, millions and millions of followers. Alim might only have 1,000 if they had any. Those million followers following a trivial person, to the masses, this is an influencer, is what they'll call them. An influencer, and therefore deserving acknowledgement of contribution in what they're contributing within the society. They deserve to be honored according to a trivial society. Yet a alim with very few followers, or probably no one knows about them because they're probably not even on social media. What happens to the society? They basically would think that that person is not of any value. And that's why the Salihin would always say, be careful from getting manipulated in when you take a path of Sirat al-Mustaqim. Very few people are probably walking on that path, but they're going to Jannah. They're going to Jannah. Very few people will be taking that path. And don't get manipulated. And don't fall into this delusion that the path that has many, many, many people walking on it, that they're actually going to be the ones that are successful. Don't confuse yourself. نرفع درجات من نشاء. Notice the word narfa. The one that elevates is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't worry about what people might say. And that's why we talked about Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah at the time, yes, he was known, but the society still didn't recognize his ilm. And that's the same thing. You talk about Ibn Rajab, you talk about many scholars. They didn't really get recognized and the ilm they contributed until later. Some even after their death is when someone just, publishes the book, or it goes and basically gets into that light and people recognize it. But just because during a certain time that alim is not recognized, the people that are looking for darajat, نرفع درجات من نشاء, you want to find those areas, find the scholars, look for the scholars, because those are the ones that have the ilm and have al-fahm, that have the comprehension, have the knowledge. And if you want to be elevated in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, know that it could only be through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It could only be through the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's basically what this ayah is taking us into. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling, تلك حجتنا آتيناها إبراهيم على قومه نرفع درجات من نشاء. How did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevate those? That's when he would say, وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ. When he was granted, notice the word وَهَبْنَا. What is al-hiba? Al-hiba is to gift somebody something. But al-hiba, when you gift someone something, they didn't pay something in contribution. In other words, it wasn't a trade. It was something that someone gave you out of their own kindness. Okay? And that's important to keep in mind. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for what Prophet Ibrahim's alayhi salam's commitment and his investment to be determined in developing, or at least in delivering the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a gift. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him Ishaq and Yaqub. So for those that are seeking to have children, remember when Prophet Zakaria alayhi salam, he wanted a child. But what did he want him for? He didn't want just a child, just, to lift his name and all of that. No. He was worried that Bani Israel would abuse that he had gotten older and that no one would be there to carry on the legacy. So he wanted a child to carry on the legacy. He wanted a child to carry on the legacy. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that he had given him Ishaq and Yaqub to carry on with the same concept, the legacy. But Prophet Zakaria, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he had given him Yahya, he said Yahya was going to be Sayyidan wa Hasura. What is Hasura? He was going to be barren. He wasn't going to get any children. He was going to be barren. Prophet Yahya alayhi salam, and for hikmah min 'ind Rabbil Alameen, Prophet Yahya alayhi salam was not going to have any children. But Prophet Yahya was going to take over the legacy. But with Prophet Ibrahim, he was barren, did not get children for a very long time. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for al-hujjah and for all that he had contributed in delivering the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given him Ishaq and Yaqub. Kullan hadayna. Each, when you say kullan, each was actually in guidance. There's nothing better and more important than having children that carry the legacy of La ilaha illallah. Ya Rab, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our children amongst those that are guided and amongst those that would be away from the fitan, and make our children and ourselves have husn al-khatima and carry the legacy of La ilaha illallah. Kullan hadayna. Each was guided. Ishaq and Yaqub. وَنُوحًا هَدَيْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِ. When you look at نُوحًا هَدَيْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِ, Nuh is not part of the offspring of Prophet Ibrahim. In fact, Nuh was thousands of years before Prophet Ibrahim. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted us to see those stations of hidayah, and that despite the many years that would come, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be the one to carry on al-hidayah itself and the light from one generation to another. From one generation to another. Remember in Surah Al-Kahf when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of an ancestor that was salih, that was righteous, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a result, had actually made the rizq be preserved for them, even though they were orphans. they didn't have anyone to support them, getting the rizq and etc., all of that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was preserving it for them. Why? As a payback and as a contribution that their ancestor had basically contributed in. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will let even their offspring for generations to come harvest the contribution that they had contributed. Ya Rabbi. وَنُوحًا هَدَيْنَا مِنْ قَبْلِ. Nuh, in other words, they were on the legacy of Prophet Nuh alayhi salam. وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِهِ. From whose dhurriyyah? Is it from dhurriyyat Nuh? Or is it from dhurriyyat Ibrahim? What is dhurriyyah? An offspring. The offspring, it goes, even though Ishaq and Yaqub, it was generations later. But, well, Yaqub, of course, ذُرِّيَّتِهِ, from Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, an offspring that continued the legacy. Dawood and Sulaiman and Ayub and Yusuf and Musa and Harun. Wanted to say generations and generations and generations to come. How many prophets were mentioned? 8. Generation after generation. وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reward those that would be in a level of al-ihsan. You know, there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ had said, بما معناه, I can't remember the exact wording, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for those that would have هم الآخرة, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala كفاه هم الدنيا. For those that would be concerned about al-akhirah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will carry the dunya and its burden off their shoulder. So they're carrying perhaps the hum of their kids' religion. They want their kids to be on the right path, on the deen, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring dunya to him. وَهِيَ رَاغِمَةٌ. What is وَهِيَ رَاغِمَةٌ? Even though the odds and the data doesn't actually show that the trajectory for dunya is looking in his favor. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring dunya to this person. وَهِيَ رَاغِمَةٌ. Even though the odds don't actually show that this is where the trajectory would head towards, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will change all the data, will change all the odds, will change the trajectory and make it in favor of this person's dunya, because their concern was al-akhirah. Their concern was al-akhirah. وَزَكَرِيَّا وَيَحْيَا وَعِيسَى وَإِلْيَاسَ. That's what's quite interesting. Some scholars actually wondered why and how these names were put in this classification. So some scholars like Tahir ibn Ashur, he basically said, well, to be honest, I couldn't understand this classification and what it was based on. Tahir ibn Ashur, he was like, I could not understand the classification and whether it was based on knowledge, understanding, power, leadership, or what exactly was it. Other scholars like al-Biqai, he said, well, he was capable. Al-Biqai is way before. I mean, he died 885 Hijriya, way before Tahir ibn Ashur. And it is very obvious that Tahir ibn Ashur benefited a lot from al-Biqai. There's no question about that. Okay, definitely. He was going many times to Tahir ibn al-Biqai, and always al-Kashaf was always, at his desk. That's obvious. But al-Biqai said, it's quite interesting. He said, when you look at the first portion, the first part of it, he said, وَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ. He said that's a direct relationship with Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, that he was given Ibrahim, he was capable of seeing his grandchild Yaqub, and he basically had seen, let's say, the reward of what he had contributed right before him. But then, in regards from ذريته, he did not witness Dawood, Sulaiman, Ayub, Yusuf, Musa, and Harun, but al-Biqa'i had said that Dawood, Sulaiman, Ayub, Yusuf, Musa, and Harun were in a high political position. We already know Dawood and Sulaiman were in a high political position. Ayub was definitely at least something important within his society, which we don't know much about. Yusuf, we already know he was basically like the treasurer in that kingdom. Musa and Harun were definitely political, military, and definitely major leaders within the society, or at least, of course, they were all Anbiya. There's no doubt about that. Okay, but the position that Ishaq had taken and Yaqub had taken, for example, they were definitely prophets, but it wasn't similar to the political leadership that Sulaiman, Dawood, Ayub, Yusuf, Musa, and Harun had basically taken. When we talk about leadership, we're talking about a large number of people basically considering the words of that particular figure and that they would follow their orders. That's a leader. Okay. So when you look at yet this group, this was quite interesting. Zakaria, Yahya, Isa, and Ilyas. We don't know much about Ilyas, but they said that Zakaria, or at least al-Biqa'i, was saying Zakaria, Yahya, Isa, and Ilyas, that they actually had a different kind of a struggle. First of all, Zakaria, Yahya, and Isa, they were living within the same time frame. Zakaria was considered as the guardian for Isa's mother, Prophet Isa alayhi salam's mother. Yahya was Zakaria's son. But what was common about these three is that there was an issue of childbearing. There was an issue of society that was definitely, they were not in leadership for sure. Zakaria alayhi salam was opposed by Bani Israel and al-Ahbar. Well, so was Yahya. Yahya was actually killed. Well, so was Zakaria. Isa alayhi salam, there was an attempt to kill him, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rafa'ahu ilayh. Ilyas, we don't know much about Prophet Ilyas, but was he within the same time frame as Prophet Isa alayhi salam and Yahya and Zakaria? Al-Biqa'i considers, and he says, which I didn't really find any evidence that supported that argument, that he was within the time frame as Zakaria and Yahya and Isa alayhi salam. But in the end is that you could see the inference that al-Biqa'i was trying to say is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given Prophet Ibrahim not only an offspring that carried the legacy, but leaders that carried the legacy, as in these prophets, and also Salihin that carried the legacy, even though they were not in the same position as these prophets, but these prophets were having a greater opposition, but they were kullun min as-salihin. You know, there's one thing that I would like to say. When you look at success, for example, we would usually think of victory as gaining some power at the end. But when you look at, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he tells us about Ashab al-Ukhdud, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about Ashab al-Ukhdud that they were actually victorious. But the story is definitely in dunya's or in this life, that we would not whatsoever regard based on dunya terms, that was success. We would right away say they were killed, they were defeated, these people were completely eliminated into a certain genocide, they were thrown in the fire. Simple as that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regards them as the ones to be in victory. In dunya terms, yes, they were basically believers, but they basically ended up dying, getting killed. Same thing if you were to look at maybe Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was also thrown in fire, and he had to leave his people. Okay, had to leave his people and was not amongst his, not even amongst his supporters. He lived in Al-Khalil in Hebron, and which is the city that I come from. I don't know if my ancestry goes back to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Be interesting, but my ancestry, as to what we know, is actually Turkish. Okay, even though I'm Palestinian, but yeah. Anyhow, that's a different story. Okay, but he lived in Al-Khalil. He was in Iraq, lived in Palestine in Al-Khalil, and certainly went to Egypt. So he wasn't really living amongst his people. And in a primitive society, that's actually scary, because a primitive society depends on the family to show support, because you weren't going to have a government that was going to pay for you if you were to be homeless, to be hungry, to be sick, etc. There was no government. It was the society. It was the family. Now that takes us to the other one, Ismail, Ilyasa, Yunus, wa Luta. According to al-Biqai, Ilyasa was, Ilyasa we don't know much about, but Ismail, Yunus, and Lut, they were not within their community. Ismail was for sure, according to the ayat, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam basically is ordered to take Ismail alayhi salam by the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a wisdom that he had preserved, to basically take Prophet Ismail alayhi salam to the land of Becca, and we know the story. Ismail alayhi salam grows there, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us the story of Prophet Ibrahim, and it's the story, we know all of that one. Okay, that was Prophet Ismail. So when he was around those, of course, later Jurhum comes and that tribe, and then they would make an agreement with Hajar to use basically the water resource that was there, which is Zamzam. And then, of course, Ismail alayhi salam marries from the tribe of Jurhum, which basically comes from Yemen. And of course, Ismail alayhi salam was not around his people. He was around his people bil Musahara. Yeah, they were probably his wife's family, but not really his family. Yunus alayhi salam. We don't know much about Ilyasa, so we'll skip Ilyasa. Okay, Yunus alayhi salam. When we see that he had left his people, then yes, he was in Nineveh, leaves his people, basically goes, and then of course we know the story about the whale basically swallowing him, and of course miraculously, so somebody's going to say, well, it's impossible for a whale to swallow a human being because of the acid in the stomach and etc. This is, the whole thing was a miracle anyway, so what are you talking about? You're not going to be using, using the dunya, what you know about science, and basically applied here, because the whole thing was a miraculous thing anyways. Okay, Waluta, Luta alayhi salam, those people were not his people, by the way. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah al-A'raf does not say that Lut was amongst his أخيهم. It doesn't say that he was أخيهم. In fact, he was not part of that society. We don't mean in terms of principle. We already agree on that one. No, in terms of ancestry. Prophet Lut alayhi salam is actually related to Prophet Ibrahim. Differences of opinions on whether he was his nephew or whether he was his brother's, his uncle's, in other words, his cousin, or whether he was his related to whether he was his uncle, all these different things. We don't really have any evidence on either opinion, but we just know that Prophet Lut alayhi salam was related to Prophet Ibrahim. Okay, that's all we know. And we know that Prophet Lut alayhi salam, since he was related to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, and the ayah was clear, it didn't say that Lut said to akhihim. It didn't say that he was telling, as basically to their brethrens or his brethrens, etc., because it was telling us that, giving us an indication that Lut alayhi salam, when he was giving da'wah, that was not his culture, that wasn't his society. So now we see, according to al-Biqai, he said Ismail, Yunus, and Lut, and possibly Ilyasa as well, but we don't have any information, that they were doing da'wah away from their own people. In other words, it was in a society that they are not familiar with. At least they're not part of that community. So Ismail, Jurhum he was doing da'wah there. They were not his people. Ilyasa, we don't know much about. Yunus, he basically was also not part of that society. Lut as well, not part of that society. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. Each was basically preferred. In other words, even though they were considered within their society as, I don't want to say abandoned, but ostracized in certain ways, that they're not part of the society, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said that they were actually preferred amongst all al-alamin, amongst all people. But I want you to look at this one. Remember when we talked about the victory terms and how the people of al-Ukhdud, for example, based on the dunya terms, that they basically had really committed suicide. This is what in dunya terms we would consider it. The people of Gaza will say, and these people are basically in a suicidal state. Okay, based on dunya terms, we'll definitely say you're right. Dunya terms, absolutely. Dunya terms, there's no question about it. This was suicide. Dunya terms, okay? But in akhirah terms, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, كُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. They were actually preferred, even though Lut needed to escape that society. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him to do what? He said, you need to basically evacuate the city at a time of duha. At a time, so we're talking about early morning, really early morning, you need to evacuate that city because there's something that's going to happen. Prophet Lut alayhi salam evacuates the city. His wife basically attempts to follow along, but then no, she's not going to basically be amongst those that would be protected. She's going to be amongst those that will be basically harmed, even though they were definitely her society. Okay, and she definitely went with Prophet Lut alayhi salam, attempted to go, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, no. She's part of al-Ghabirin, she's going to be with them. Because did she actually practice at least, all of that sexual aberration? No, she didn't. So what did she do? She accepted it. She supported it. And this is extremely important to keep in mind. Supporting an ideology, supporting a certain behavior, actually means you're part of that, even if you don't actually practice it yourself. All right? Just keep that one in mind. Because especially with those isms out there, you are part of that ism if you support it, even with a like, even with a share, even if you support the idea and back the idea at work or wherever. Just be careful with that one. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is considering those stances that you would take as determining your Jannah and determining your hellfire. You have to determine your stances. كُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. All Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had elevated beyond all. I want you to look at this one. So let's erase a couple things here. Okay, we're going to erase a couple things here because we need to see a couple paradigms. Let's say. So here, نرفع درجات من نشاء. How were they elevated? Who was elevated? Number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, elevation, كُلًّا هَدَيْنَا. Here's the first kind of elevation, just to give hidayah. Just to give hidayah, you're elevated beyond all. You know, it takes me back to Surah Fatir. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say in Surah Fatir? Let's go back to Surah Fatir for a bit, right? Hold on, just remember 147. Let's go back to Surah Fatir for a bit. Let's go to Luqman. No, it's going to be right after Surah Yasin. Let's see, what surah is this? This is Al-Ahzab. We'll go to Surah Fatir. I want you to see something, all right? Let's go like that. I'm going to find it, right? I want you to see something. Because there's actually, okay, here we go. إن الذين يتلون كتاب الله وأقاموا الصلاة وأنفقوا مما رزقناهم سرا وعلانية يرجون تجارة لن تبور ليوفيهم أجورهم ويزيدهم من فضله إنه غفور شكور والذي أوحينا إليك من الكتاب هو الحق مصدقا لما بين يديه إن الله بعباده لخبير بصير ثم أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا من عبادنا فمنهم ظالم لنفسه ومنهم مقتصد ومنهم سابق بالخيرات بإذن الله ذلك هو الفضل الكبير. Let's look at these ayat for a bit. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those that would recite the book of Allah and they would perform the prayers, they would spend from what we had given them in private and in public. And they would seek a trade that would never be in loss, to compensate them for what they had contributed, and he would multiply from his blessings. He is all forgiving and thankful, or at least would pay back in abundance. وَالَّذِي أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ هُوَ الْحَقِّ. And what we had revealed unto you from the book is the truth. It confirms what was revealed in the past. For the Lord Almighty is all seeing and all knowing of his servants. Then later, this is the key one. Then later, أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا من عبادنا. Those that were chosen, selected from our servants, inherited the book. That is the message. Yet, from them are those that oppress themselves, and some would live up to the limit, and others would compete in doing what is good by the will of the Lord Almighty. That is from the abundance of giving that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the great abundance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give. That is, جَنَّاتُ عَدْنٍ يَدْخُلُونَهَا. They will enter the paradise of Adan. They would be beautified with أَسَاوِرَ مِنْ ذَهَبٍ, with bracelets made of gold and pearls, and their garments are made of silk. And they would say, all the praise be to the Lord that had uplifted the sorrow. For the Lord Almighty is all forgiving and all, well, thankful. It wouldn't be thankful. It would be the one to pay back in whatever good one would do. The one that had given us the residence in the place of eternity from his blessings. No harm and no illness would prick us. Now, when you look at this ayah, why did I actually get there? Because in that surah that we were doing, Surah Al-An'am, there's actually a correlation. I want you to look at the word awrathna. This is the key word here. What is al-mirath? Al-mirath is inheritance. And the inheritance, we would usually think of it as inheriting money. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that no. أَوْرَثْنَا الْكِتَابَ الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا. In other words, if you were given the blessings to memorize Quran, the blessings to learn the Quran, learn al-Wahy, learn Islam, you were chosen. Congratulations. You were amongst those that are الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا. Congratulations for listening to the lecture. Congratulations for learning Islam. Congratulations for getting the blessings of this inspiration. فَمِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. But الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا مِنْ عِبَادِنَا, they were chosen, but indeed, some of them might have already committed some certain sins. ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. Some of them had oppressed themselves, which actually takes us back when you look at فَمِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ وَمِنْهُمْ مُقْتَصِدٌ. Muqtasid, they'll do what is halal and avoid what is haram. You know, they'll just stick to the limit. They don't necessarily get into major sins, some minor sins here and there, but not necessarily to the level of ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ, where they oppress themselves, in other words, transgress the limit. But others, no. They are competing with not those that they are seeing. They're competing with the salihin, perhaps the salihin of the past. سَابِقٌ بِالْخَيْرَاتِ. Now, when you look at أَوْرَثْنَا الْكِتَابَ الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا مِنْ عِبَادِنَا فَمِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. Let's look into the ayat that we were doing, 147. Here we go. Notice this one. الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُمْ بِظُلْمٍ أُولَٰئِكَ لَهُمُ الْأَمْنُ وَهُمْ مُهْتَدُونَ. Here's the first connection with that ayah. What was that one? This one is saying, آمَنُوا أَلَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُمْ بِظُلْمٍ. The other one was أَوْرَثْنَا الْكِتَابَ الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا فَمِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. Here it is, that correlation. What is the correlation? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically telling us, well, نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَنْ نَشَاءُ. Those that basically لَمْ يَلْبِسُوا إِيمَانَهُمْ بِظُلْمٍ. This is basically a high level. They would not be amongst, when you look at that ayah, of course, فَمِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. There are 3 stages according to that ayah. Oh, I wish what page was that? Was it 447? Let me see. Yes, it was. Alhamdulillah. Okay. There are 3 stages. مِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. Let's point that out. Okay. This is the first stage. مِنْهُمْ ظَالِمٌ لِنَفْسِهِ. Second stage, مقتصد. Third stage, سابق بالخيرات. Okay, what was Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam pointing out? He was pointing out, and according to Tafseer Mujahid, that he was pointing out that hujjah, that argument, is that what are we doing here? Let's go back to that page again. That لم يلبسوا الذين آمنوا ولم يلبسوا إيمانهم بظلم. They did not include in their faith any type of a transgression. So what does that mean? Is this talking about those that are muqtasid or those that are sabiqun bil khayrat? Possibly. Okay? Because the ones that ظالم لنفسه were definitely excluded in this one. لم يلبسوا إيمانهم بظلم. Okay? Now let's see. Then نرفع درجات من نشاء. Okay, what will those get? Because in that other ayah, ثم أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا. Let's go back to it. This is Surah Fatir. أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا. Now it's talking about those that were chosen. Let's go back. Okay, those that were chosen, what do they get? Okay, here's what they get. نرفع درجات من نشاء. They would get a certain hiba. الدنيا أتته وهي راغمة. They were contributing for the akhirah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings a dunya for them despite all the odds. كُلًّا هَدَيْنَا. The other thing that they would get is that they would be basically, by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, given hidayah. Now the legacy that they had invested in, which is in hidayah. So even if you probably did not give hidayah to your children, maybe it wasn't as you had really hoped for, but invest in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah will give the hidayah even if it is for the children later to come. Let's say, كُلًّا هَدَيْنَا. And what happened? كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Another type of daraja that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we're talking about narfa'u darajat. Why did it come into plural? Why narfa'u darajat? Why darajat and not one daraja? Because it was telling us that there is a daraja of hidayah. That's one daraja. There's a daraja of power. That's another type of daraja. What does it mean, power? Maybe money. Maybe political power. Maybe charisma. That's a different kind. Each one basically had a different kind of power. Yusuf alayhi salam, he was basically given mental power and was capable of being the treasurer, but even though in the beginning, of course, if Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam was not thrown in the well, he would not have been the one to probably make it to the palace. He isn't until he was thrown in the well, and that's what basically led at the end that Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam finds his way to the palace. If he was stayed with his brothers, he would have probably been in search of government assistance, just like his brothers were in search of government assistance and coming to the palace in order to get government assistance. La ilaha illallah. Okay, let's see. The other part. كل من الصالحين. Another type of daraja is الصلاح. Notice that الصلاح, الإحسان, الهداية. That's the most important power. That's the most important value. That's the most important gain. That's the most important compensation that you would get for the contribution. وَكُلًّا فَضَّلْنَا عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. التفضيل. To be preferred beyond all. Let's say, وَمِنْ آبَائِهِمْ وَذُرِّيَّاتِهِمْ وَإِخْوَانِهِمْ. And from their آبائهم, آباء who? From their fathers. ذُرِّيَّاتِهِمْ, from their children, their brethren, and وَجْتَبَيْنَاهُمْ, and they were selected. What does وَجْتَبَيْنَاهُم remind us of? Let's go back to that ayah. اصطفينا. ثم أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا من عبادنا. The word اجتبينا means اصطفينا. The word اجتبينا means اصطفينا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that to be chosen, to be preferred beyond others, you have to be min ibadina. You have to be a servant and a servant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And number two is that you would have to be on hidayah in order to basically get elevated. You would have to be on al-hidayah. And therefore, وَهَدَيْنَاهُمْ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. And we had guided them to the straight path. ذَلِكَ هُدَى اللَّهِ يَهْدِي بِهِ مَن يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. That's the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would guide whomever He wills from His servants. وَلَوْ أَشْرَكُوا لَحَبِطَ عَنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. Here's a theme. If they had associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the word is لَا حَبِطَ. What does لَا حَبِطَ mean? It basically is coming in to tell us, well, the reason why they were given tafdeel, the reason why they were given all those darajat, all those darajat were actually coming in because they basically had contributed in al-hidayah. They contributed in al-hidayah. Since they contributed in al-hidayah, then they deserved to be elevated. And such an elevation is basically when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen them, but that elevation would be only if they would be هديناهم إلى صراط مستقيم, if they would be guided. ذلك هدى الله يهدي به من يشاء من عباده ولو أشركوا. Now remember, there's a tahliyah. The Quran would always lay out, tell you, well, here's an affirmation and here is a rejection, or at least an opposition, or a statement that completely nullifies what we were saying. So what does that mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَلَوْ أَشْرَكُوا لَحَبِطَ عَنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. If they had engaged in anything that nullifies their faith, a shirk, then everything that they had contributed would basically get into corruption, would basically come into complete loss. In other words, أولئك الذين آتيناهم الكتاب والحكم والنبوة. Those are the ones that were given. Look at the word given. Who? Well, the ones that are basically on the huda Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were given al-kitab, the book, al-hukm, power, an-nubuwwah, and prophethood. Wait a minute. What's the difference between all of these? Al-kitab is revelation. Al-kitab is revelation. Wait, but did they all get al-kitab? No, not all of them got al-kitab, but they were carrying the legacy. There's a difference between a nabi and the rasul, with differences of opinions between scholars on which one basically is following the legislature of the past. Is it nabi or is it rasul, or which one basically has his own set of legislature? Okay, differences of opinions, but regardless, al-kitab, meaning that they were following, one, the same aqidah. Two, al-hukm is a legislature. This isn't talking about power alone. In other words, to be on al-huda, you basically have to have, number one, to be on guidance, you have to have the aqidah in place in al-kitab. As you would say, there are 6,236 ayahs in the Quran, 6,236 ayahs in the Quran. Almost only 350 to 700 ayat are related to legislature. All the rest are related to aqidah, related to creed. your understanding about Allah, your understanding about death, your understanding about life, your understanding about prophets, your understanding about malaika, your understanding, all of that. That's related to how you understand basically all this ghaib. More than 2/3 of the Quran, more than 2/3 of the Quran is related to aqidah. So therefore, أولئك الذين آتيناهم الكتاب والحكم. الحكم, when you speak about hukum, you can talk about hukum to mean power, or you can talk about it in terms of legislature. So the kitab is basically the ilm of what you know about life, what you know about Allah, what you know about all those details. In practice, that's going to be called al-hukum. Al-hukum is going to be in practice. It's how you implement the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in action. That's al-hukum. That's al-hukum. How you implement it in action. So that's why when we say الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, Iman, it's not enough to believe about Allah and believe about the prophets and all of that. No, it's عَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Where's your contribution? Al-amal. How do you make that idea be an action to be implemented on ground? What does that mean? Your understanding of justice. How is that to be implemented on ground? How do you practice that? An-nubuwwah. In-nubuwwah is prophethood. So what does that mean? In order to understand al-aqidah and legislature, there has to be another category, which is an-nubuwwah, prophethood being part, al-wahy, being the lens that you would see through al-kitab, al-hukum, legislature would be the lens that you would see through the world in order to know the truth. Now, let's go back to that ayah right there. Where were we? Surah Fatir right there. When you look at الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا مِنْ عِبَادِنَا, here's al-wahy telling us and bring us back to it. وَالَّذِينَ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَالَّذِي أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ هُوَ الْحَقِّ. What is that? Taking us to the same word, an-nubuwwah. Going back to an-nubuwwah in order to understand, of course, because if you want to do a tafseer, you got to connect those ayat together and relate those ayat together in order to understand it right. فَإِنْ يَكْفُرْ بِهَا هَؤُلَاءِ فَقَدْ وَكَّلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ. If they were to deny it, then وَكَّلْنَا. Yesterday, I was actually looking at the word وَكَّلْنَا from one tafsir to another. Why وَكَّلْنَا? If they were to deny it, فَقَدْ وَكَّلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ. We had then, what is tawkeel? Tawkeel to give you a power of attorney. Tawkeel is to make you then responsible for something and you're going to do the job on somebody's behalf. That's it, tawkeel. That's it, tawkeel. You're doing the job on somebody's behalf. So what does that mean? If they choose not to carry the legacy, then who is this talking to? This is talking to the Prophet ﷺ, Muhammad ibn Abdullah ﷺ, to tell and let the people that are during his time and later as well, if they don't want to carry the legacy, ثم أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا من عبادنا, if they don't want to be amongst those that are chosen to carry the legacy from our servants, basically, they don't want to carry the legacy, then وَكَلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give that power of attorney to carry the legacy of those prophets to a nation and another group of people that would not deny it. They would embrace it. In other words, if someone chooses not to carry the legacy of ilm, legacy of Quran, legacy of da'wah, you'll be replaced. Allah is not in need for you. Allah is not in need for you. You are in need of Allah. You are in need of Allah. So when you look at what this page is really saying, this page is telling us, well, this is how the story started. Where and how do you continue the legacy? Are you going to be part of those وَكَّلْنَا بِهَا قَوْمًا لَيْسُوا بِهَا بِكَافِرِينَ? Are you going to be part of أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَى اللَّهُ? Are you going to be part of those that are اصطفينا من عبادنا and going to be part of those أورثنا الكتاب? Or what position and where are you going to be on this map? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, فَبِهُدَاهُ مُقْتَدِهِ. Then take their guidance as the footsteps that you would follow. What is al-iqtida? When we say qada, that means there's a leadership, there's a certain path, there's one that's leading, and there's a certain path that I would follow. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, follow their guidance. What does it mean? What guidance? The guidance that you would find in the kitab and in practice and in al-wahy. قُلْ لَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ أَجْرًا. Why? Tell them, I'm not asking for a compensation, because guess what? You got to prepare yourself to be on the path of haqq. Actually means you may lose some things in dunya. Don't ask for people to compensate you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring it to you, but let them know, and you also let yourself know. Yes, if you migrate for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will not be getting the same privileges that you probably might be getting in that other country. You might not be getting the same type of income. You might not be getting the same type of dunya. You may not be getting the same type of privileges, but that's because if your hijrah was for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then expect not dunya to come to you, but you're getting closer to the akhirah. In huwa illa dhikra lil alamin. And it's a reminder for all the people and for all those nations to come. What path are you going to choose to take? What path do you want to be a part of? Which group do you want to be a part of? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said that they would be part of الَّذِينَ اصْطَفَيْنَا مِنْ عِبَادِنَا, and make us amongst those that سَابِقُونَ بِالْخَيْرَاتِ, and make us amongst those that would get جَنَّاتُ عَدْنٍ يَدْخُلُونَهَا يُحَلَّوْنَ فِيهَا مِنْ أَسَاوِرَ مِنْ ذَهَبٍ وَلُؤْلُؤًا وَلِبَاسُهُمْ فِيهَا حَرِيرٌ. وقالوا الحمد لله الذي أذهب عنا الحزن إن ربنا لغفور شكور الذي أحلنا دار المقامة من فضله لا يمسنا فيها نصب ولا يمسنا فيها لغوب. This is it. I know we kind of went from one subject to another, but inshallah there's khair in it. Inshallah there is something that we could all remember. Inshallah tomorrow will continue, and there's definitely a lot to say always.
It's full of treasure. Jazakallahu khairan. Very, very decent. There is decent. MashaAllah, MashaAllah.
Allah yahfaduk ya Rabbi, and barakallahu feekum. You know, yesterday it was, one thing I could say is that sometimes finding the ayat that relate to one another, it needs some brainstorming. It's like, which ayah completes the idea with this one?
How you reach it? Wondering.
I don't really know. Fath min Rabbil Alameen, that's all I say.
الحمد
Fatih
لله.
min Rabbil Alameen. Why Surah Fatir? It was really that وكلنا بها قوما ليسوا بها بكافرين. That was that key word, and I just remembered that ayah, that ثم أورثنا الكتاب الذين اصطفينا من عبادنا, and I just connected. I was like, wait a minute, there is this connection between these two, and how al-mirath is actually related. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us about this mirath, that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, and what he was given, darajat min nasha, and the mirath and the legacy that he had left behind. And not always is the legacy going to be in power, but the legacy was in al-ihsan. The legacy is in al-salah. The legacy is in the tafdeel that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would regard. The legacy is اجتبيناهم وهديناهم إلى صراط مستقيم. That the most important legacy that you would carry is basically the legacy of recognizing al-wahy, implementing it, and putting it into hidayah. That's the most important thing. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that would live on this legacy, and make us amongst those that would recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not only through our hearts, but also through our minds, and put our knowledge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into practice, and make it into a amal, and
آمين
make this the light that will enlighten us في الدنيا والآخرة. اللهم آمين.
آمين آمين. جزاك الله خيرا وزادك الله علما.
Ameen, Ya Rabbi. Ameen. Barakallahu fiki. If there are any questions or if there are any comments, I'd be happy to listen to it. Let's see. She said, I have a question that I've been contemplating a lot. How do I cultivate Jannah in my heart? I feel like this lecture you did today pierced through in a way that nothing else had for the past month and a half. To cultivate in Jannah, the more you know about something, the stronger it becomes visual to you. The stronger you relate to it in your mind, it becomes something that moves from your mental vision to a heart vision. Like you said, it basically entered my heart. You won't be capable of letting something go into your heart unless you take the moment to learn more about it and understanding it in your mind. And that's when it moves from a thought and a recognition in mind to something that is relating to an emotion that you relate to wholeheartedly. And there's even a farther step, and that is when it goes into your spirit, into your ruh. That's even a higher level. That's a level of an ihsan. You would start feeling like Jannah is nearby. You would start feeling and seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at every corner. You would start feeling and enjoying a dhikr like something that you would enjoy, not a burden. You would do that dhikr and just feel that this is the coolness that is basically getting into taking away every burden. Whenever you are probably facing a calamity, the calamity, you don't even see a calamity. You would see, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Whenever you would face pain, Ya Allah, Allahumma inna Allahumma anta shafi, la shifa illa shifak. You would just see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's shifa. You would just see the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's even a higher level than letting it pierce into your heart. When it goes even farther, where you would see pain as nothing but ease. When you start seeing a challenge as nothing but in something that is another opportunity to go up, نرفع درجات من نشاء. When you start seeing and reinterpreting everything that surrounds you with what? A new interpretation. What is that new interpretation? That new interpretation is آتيناهم الكتاب والحكم والنبوة, and then they would become the ones to reinterpret what people might, based on their terms, consider it as failure. You would see it as success. What people might say as loss, you would see it as I got a value. What people might see it as you went down in your position, you would see it, but I actually went up. درجات من نشاء, in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that basically said فضلنا وكلا فضلنا على العالمين. It's reinterpret based on the lens of Quran and Sunnah, and that's the lens of Quran. The lens of Quran is to basically see that victory is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defines as victory. And that al-istifa is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had defined as what makes somebody preferred. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى الهدى والعفو. And we ask it for our children. And we ask it for ourselves for حسن الخاتمة. اللهم آمين. سبحانك اللهم بحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. If there's anybody that would like to say anything, I would love to hear it.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Aisha. Thank you.
الله يرضى عنك يا رب. الله يحفظك يا رب.